view things, and maybe you don't. I guess I shouldn't categorize or judge you where you like to line your thinking up with, but generally I like things real simple, right? There's right and there's wrong, and that's it. There's just here's yes and there's no, and that's it. And I think it's at least worthy of us to spend some time once in a while to consider what God says about how you discern right and wrong. It's interesting, the Hebrew writer in Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 14 says, those who are able to sustain strong meat, right? The weightier matters of God's instructions, they have their senses discerning, ability to discern the difference between good and evil, he said in that text. It's a reminder of what Paul's trying to accomplish here in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, where he's trying to get that audience of people to recognize that their understanding of the letter of the law, right? The letter of the law is it's okay to eat a steak, right? That's basically Paul's argument here. The letter of the law says it is fine for you to have a piece of meat with your dinner. It's perfectly okay. And then the secondary question comes, well, what if that came from that idol's temple over there? What if that meat that I'm purchasing to buy to consume actually came from the marketplace, but it had the night before been offered on that idolatrous altar over there? Am I still okay? Is that right? And Paul says, well, we know that the truth is that so-called gods are just that. They're just so-called gods. They don't really exist. They don't have any authority. They don't have any power. They don't have any reality, though men might describe or prescribe certain things to them. And so our superior, if you will, understanding, Paul's words, of who God is and that He's the only one that's real, then why are we concerning ourselves with where that steak came from? Because we don't have to be concerned about a God that really doesn't exist. But then he switches, right? At the end of that context that Anthony just read for us, that's his initial response to the idea. Is it okay? And the answer is yes. Is it right? Yes. Should I? And Paul says maybe. Or maybe not. Is this going to cause your brother to stumble? Is it going to tempt him to go up to that idol? And when he goes and grabs that steak, he actually thinks he's worshiping that idol when he does that. And if you have led him to think that way by your behavior, now you're right. Your understanding of the law has actually caused a problem for your brother. Now, I simply start you in our study tonight in this text to just get you thinking this way, right? That there's the ability for right to actually be wrong. The letter of the law isn't all that God asks of us. God wants us to think deeper and discern deeper than just the letter of some instruction, rule, law, policy, guidance. He wants us to think deeper than that to make the proper decisions and the proper discernments in the process. And so this evening, can we do that? Let's study for a little while about this idea that right absolutely can be wrong, and to maybe think beyond just the letter of the law. And sometimes we ask the question, right, is it allowed? Is that a sufficient enough question? Well, it might be a good starter question, but it's not an end-all question. Is this allowed might be the first step in the process, but that might not be all that I have to ask. I may want to think about, is this action lawful? Is it permitted? Is it technically right? But it may still be spiritually challenging. The context of motive may create a problem with that, and that'll be our process tonight, where we think about if our eating of meat offends our brother, then our liberty, our understanding of right may not be the best course of action. So let's look at it through tonight, what we might call three lenses, three viewpoints that help us understand these things. And the first one is, do I have the right to do this? Yes, maybe, but does it help my brother? Is it going to edify and encourage him? I want you to go over into that text that we just read there in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Let me break it down a little bit further with you, beginning in verse 7 of 1 Corinthians chapter 8. He notices, he says, however, right, verse 6 verses, perfectly right for you to eat that meat. Perfectly fine for you to do that. Those gods aren't even real, right? That's the first 6 verses, letter of the law. What right is. But then he says, however, think it differently. However, there is not in everyone that knowledge. Not everybody understands that when they eat that meat, they're really not worshiping an idol. They're really not worshiping another god, because that god doesn't even exist. Not everybody has that knowledge. For some, with consciousness of the idol until now, eat it as the thing offered to an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. You're challenging them. They begin to believe that they're actually worshiping the idol. But food does not commend us to God, for neither if we eat are we better, nor if we do not eat are we the worse. The law says God doesn't care, right, whether you eat or don't eat. It doesn't make you better if you do. It doesn't make you worse if you don't. There's indifference in that sense in the eyes of God. But beware, verse 9, lest somehow this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to those who are weak. You may know what the law is. You may know what the precision of what is right, but others may not. And your actions and your behaviors may actually cause them to stumble who are weak, and you're never given authority or permission to do that. If anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will not the conscience of him who is weak be emboldened to eat those things offered to idols? And because of your knowledge shall the weak brother perish for whom Christ died. Paul does an interesting thing for us here. He says there's more to the letter of the law, right? There's more to it than that. He says you need to consider, how is your brother going to view this? What about that weak brother who doesn't understand, who doesn't have the conscience of understanding about that idol and what's actually happening? What happens to him in this process? Are you considering what might occur to his faith and his convictions if you pursue what might be legally right? When you thus sin, that's a strong word in verse 12. When you thus sin against the brethren and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Now it's more deep, right? Who would have ever thought that if I observe the letter of the law that somehow all of a sudden it's equated as sin? But that's what Paul says. Paul says you can live the letter of the law all day long. Go ahead and go into that idol temple. Go ahead and sit down and have a meal. Go ahead and go down to the marketplace and buy that steak, and you are within the letter of the law. But when that brother of weak conscience sees it, and now he's acting and behaving in ways against his conscience and creating weaknesses of faith and stumbling blocks to him, you've not only sinned against him, but you've sinned against the one who died for him. You've sinned against Christ. Right can be wrong. The letter of the law was insufficient to make the right discernment and to understand what is good and evil in that circumstance. This liberty becomes a stumbling block, and the knowledge, he said in the first part of the chapter, begins to puff us up. But charity edifies. Verse 13, therefore, if food makes thy brothers stumble, I will never again eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. I love Paul's conviction here. If my choice is never touch another steak again or cause my brother to stumble, I'll give up steak every day of the week, right? That's Paul's point. I love my brother more than I love these things that I know are right. I appreciate the conscience of my brother and his faith and his relationship with Jesus. That is more important to me than any perfectly understood right and lawful action that may not always be expedient. Let me add another context with you. Romans chapter 14. I'm always cautious with this text. I understand context, right? You've got to appreciate who's he talking to, what's he talking about, what's the purpose. But because sometimes we can just throw everything into Romans 14 as if everything just kind of falls under that, and don't think the Bible would allow for that. But I do want us to see some things that it does talk about. Verse 13 of chapter 14 of the book of Romans, therefore let us not judge one another anymore, but rather resolve this, not to put a stumbling block or a cause to fall in your brother's way. I know and am convinced by the Lord Jesus that that there is nothing unclean of itself, but to him who considers anything to be unclean, to him it is unclean. There were Jewish Christians, right? There were folks who come out of Judaism that struggled with this idea. They had been raised to understand here are things that were clean and allowable to eat. Here were things that weren't allowed. Here were feast days to remember, and here were days, right? They understood all that letter of the Old Testament law, and they struggled with balancing, how do I kind of come out of those old traditional patterns and embrace the new liberties that I have in Jesus? And he says it's challenging for folks to understand the genuine letter of the law when it comes to these things. Yet, verse 15, if your brother is grieved because of your food, you are no longer walking in love. Do not destroy with your food the one for whom Christ died. It's the same thought process that Paul said to Corinth. Do not let your understanding of the letter of the law convince you that it's okay to offend and challenge the conscience of your brother. Your love for him should supersede your understanding, your greater understanding in some senses of that law that God has given and the liberties that come with it. Therefore, verse 16, do not let your good be spoken of as evil. Do not let your adherence to your rights and your liberties cloud your thinking that that's okay to act in that way that doesn't show much edification or love towards your brother. For the kingdom of God is not eating and drinking, but righteousness and peace and joy in the Holy Spirit. But beyond just the letter of the law, it's not sufficient to just ask, is this precisely what God would permit? Is this something that God's given me liberty to act upon? I've got to think beyond that, and I've got to begin to think, does this affect, and in what ways does it affect those around me? And how does it help or hinder the edification of their faith and the challenges it might bring? When our liberty becomes a stumbling block to others, we need to stop. And we might understand the process of those idols meaning nothing, right? And we might have a clearer understanding of that. But our right of action becomes wrong when it destroys the conscience and creates a stumbling block for others. Are we exercising our freedom at the expense of somebody else's spiritual health? And that's a question that has to be asked. And sometimes isn't, which creates a situation where right becomes wrong. Number two, is it expedient? It may be right, it may be lawfully right, but is it the most expedient, the most beneficial, the most profitable, the most helpful thing to do in that moment? Notice the comparison on the chart. For something to be lawful, often in our mind, does it meet the minimum standard of the law, right? Am I doing just enough to say this is legal, this is lawful, this is something that's permissible, this is something that I'm allowed to do? And sometimes those rights, often in our minds, supersede anything and everything else. And we never ask, maybe the greater question is not just is it right, but is it expedient? Right's a fair question. It's a starting point. But the secondary questions need to be asked too. Does it show love and edification to my brother, or is it a stumbling block? Is it the most expedient action, the most profitable and helpful way? Does it advance the kingdom? Does it build folks up? Does it create the benefit? Does it help others grow, or does it put them in a further weakened state? Those are all fair questions that we have to ask. Paul wrote this in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 23. He said, all things are lawful for me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but all things edify not. Not everything that's right brings edification. Not everything that I precisely determine that God would say okay to that does the edification and the encouragement that it should. What I love about Paul is he says, listen, of anybody that might have understood the law, it would have been Paul, right? Of anyone who understood rights and what God had given him liberty to act upon, Paul would have been the guy. And yet he even pushed the pause button and said, even in lawful things, even in things God would say you're perfectly permissible to act in that way, he said, I don't, because it doesn't bring the edification sometimes that we desire to bring. There are three views maybe that we could see And how do I make the right decision when they conflict? Right? There's the divine command of God. Maybe there's civil law that we're looking at. And then maybe there's the traditions and religious practices of men's day. And what happens when those rings begin to intersect with each other and they begin to create conflict? How do I determine what's right in that circumstance? Not everything happens in a vacuum, right? Not everything happens in some very clean and precise way. Sometimes we've got to use some discernment. And something might be perfectly legal in a secular way, but not what God would ask for. And sometimes maybe it might be an acceptable religious practice, but it doesn't fit within the divine commands of God. How do I discern which road to take, which path and decision to make when we hit those conflict spots in relationship to that? What happens when those laws collide? And you think about it in a simplistic way. So take civil authority for an example. There might be something that's legal in the laws of the land, but that's not enough, right? That shouldn't be enough for any of us. Just because man has decided it's legal doesn't necessarily make it the best thing. Is it secularly legal? Okay. Yes. Does it align with God's law? Yes. And then, okay, then let's obey, right? That's chapter 13 of the book of Romans. If you're still right there, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, right? Paul's pretty clear. And by the way, that was a governing authority that not everybody loved. The governing authority was Rome, and not everybody was in love with Rome. We've talked before in the past about who were the zealots in the days of Jesus. One of his own chosen apostles was Simon Zelotes, Simon the Zealot. And the Zealots were a group of Jews who were adamantly opposed to any kind of Roman rule in Judea. They were absolutely opposed to anything Roman being in charge of anything in Judea. They were the rebellious ones who were continually at odds with Roman rule. There are times where what God commands and what the law, the civil law might permit, don't work in harmony. They actually collide against one another. And yet then sometimes they do. And so is it legal in the laws of the land? Yes, okay. Would God say it's legal? Okay, then do verse 1 of Romans 13. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, even when it's challenging. If it's not something that puts us in conflict with God, then we need to honor the governing bodies. For there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Sometimes those authorities aren't the kind of men and people that we would think they ought to be, right? Sometimes people get into positions of authority, and in our minds we think, why them? Right? Why did that person, and you go back through history, and you can begin to point out all kinds of evil men, and you say, how did they end up in a position of authority? How did they? And quite frankly, I don't always know. I do know this, God has never left His creation alone in that. Paul seems to indicate that God's work is behind the things that happen, and even the permissive nature of God allows for certain authorities. Nebuchadnezzar wasn't a great and good man, but God used him to fulfill the purposes that he needed to be done as it related to God's own people, right? And my point, friends, is that the question we need to ask isn't, do I like the law? The question isn't, do I like it? The question is, does it conflict with God? And if it doesn't conflict with God, Paul says, my responsibility is to be subject to the governing authorities. But what happens if it does conflict? Well, that's Acts 5, right? What do we do if it does conflict? What happens when what's legal in the laws of the land are at odds with what God has desired or wanted? Well, Acts 5, verse 22, Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. We are going to obey the laws of the land so much as they stay in harmony with the laws of God. When those laws begin to conflict and collide with the laws of God, then we're going to do what God says always. Right? When the laws collide, there's a path by which that helps us discern what's right. And believers shouldn't ask first, what's the law of the land? Believers should always ask first, what's the law of God? And then make a decision as to whether the laws of God and the laws of men collide. Do they contradict, or are they in harmony with one another in such a way that that we can fulfill what God wants from us without being in conflict with the laws of the land? I think sometimes we become so focused on what's right, what's legally right according to the Constitution, according to the laws of the state of West Virginia, according to whatever. We become so enamored with our thinking that that's like the end all of the whole question, and it's not. Because sometimes the laws of any land, in any time period, in any place, may be in conflict with what God has actually said, and I must obey God rather than man. Right can be wrong. The rights of a land, the rights of a secular law, the rights of the land of a people, when they conflict what God desires and they collide with His will and His purposes, then we must choose God over what might be civilly right. Jesus dealt with this on a couple of different occasions, and I want to note them with you. Go over into Mark chapter 7 for a minute. I'll start there. Because there was a time period where folks were taking maybe a secular right or permission that was allowed, but they began to blur it with what God had said or spiritual contexts in which they ought to be honoring. Mark chapter 7, beginning in verse 6, he answered and said, this is Jesus speaking, well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandment of God, you hold the tradition of men, the washing of pitchers and cups, and many other such things you do. He said to them, all too well you reject the commandment of God that you may keep your tradition. Jesus had a challenge with these folks, and it was simply this, that when they were trying to maneuver through, when their traditions and God's law collided, they were choosing tradition. And I want you to just ask yourself a question for a moment. Could that still happen? It can still happen. Where we are so steeped in a traditional view of something that we would even turn a blind eye to what God has actually said about it because I'm committed to the way I've always done something. They were committed to their ritualistic cleansing of the utensils and the things they were using in their worship. They were so committed to these kind of traditional viewpoints of how they ought to go about things that it didn't really matter what God had said to them. It was right according to their traditions. It fit what the traditions of the elders had shared with them. But all the while, they're rejecting the commandments of God in the process. Let me illustrate it in another context. Matthew chapter 23. It's interesting, right? Because you might say, well, is it okay to call my parent father, right? Is that okay? And you might say, well, it's the proper definition of who Warren Price was in my household, right? And so, yes, it's okay to use that. But what happens if it goes further than that? Notice verse 9, again, the words of Jesus. Do not call anyone on earth your father For one is your Father, he, capital F, by the way, one is your Father who is in heaven. And do not be called teachers, for one is your teacher, the Christ. By the way, quick thought. You ever notice how we have a conversation about don't call anyone father, but we never talk about don't call anyone teacher? Interesting, right? We do it all the time. Who was your first grade teacher? Right? Because we understand the context of what Jesus is talking about here, right? He's talking about when you're giving people authoritative spiritual titles, that's not permissible. When you're exalting individuals above the status of man, when you have elevated people in such a way that you're actually prescribing titles to them that really ought to belong just in certain paths, particularly with the word father in this context, then you've taken what might be right in some senses and made it wrong. It might be perfectly permissible and right to call your dad father. It may be perfectly right to refer to your third grade teacher as your teacher. But Jesus says that right, that liberty, that permissive action becomes wrong when it's a measure by which to elevate in some spiritual context and exalting somebody to a higher position than they really should have. And so right can be wrong. What seems like something that could be permissible can become wrong if it's in the wrong context, used in the wrong venue or place. Go to 2 John and verse 9, short one verse or one chapter book. Could it ever be wrong to show hospitality? That doesn't seem even like a question, right? How could it ever be wrong to show hospitality? Shouldn't hospitality be always extended no matter what? Well, not necessarily. 2 John verse 9, whoever transgresses and does not abide the doctrine of Christ does not have God. He who abides in the doctrine of Christ has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this doctrine, do not receive him into your house, nor greet him, for he who greets him shares in his evil deeds. If you've identified somebody as someone who is teaching, preaching, guiding, leading people in heresy, in things that are contrary to the commands of God, John in his writings here actually forbids even the simplest of things of greetings and hospitality. We might think, well, it's always right to be hospitable. No, context may tell us different. If the context is among false teachers, if the context is among those who are perpetrating heresy, if they're trying to use your influence to move and push forward their errors, then you've got to even say no to things like hospitality. What's your point, preacher? My point is that context sometimes will demand the difference between right and wrong. Am I trying to exalt somebody to a spiritual status that Jesus said no one should have except God the Father? Or maybe Jesus as the master teacher. Are traditions wrong? No. But when you teach them as superior to the commands of God, now they become wrong. Is it okay to have traditional ways of doing things? Is it okay to have traditions that you follow in the manner in which you use expediencies to fulfill God's purposes? Sure. But the minute those traditions become so entrenched in our minds that we believe them to be even superior to the commands of God, now right has become wrong. Context will dictate to us. When we see that through that lens of where these things intersect and they begin to collide with one another, where am I going to line myself with? And just because I might say, well, there's nothing wrong with hospitality. There's nothing wrong with calling somebody teacher. There's nothing wrong. Well, maybe not in every context. What we've determined to be right may actually have become wrong because of the context in which it's happening. And then finally, I need to look at right and wrong through what we might call the lens of integrity. What's my motive? Right? What's my motive behind doing what's right? And I simply ask, is it possible for somebody to do the right thing for the wrong reasons? And the answer is yes, right? The imagery on the screen here, it illustrates it, right? All sometimes we see is the small part of the iceberg, right? That's at the surface. We just see the small part. We see just the actions of somebody, but we don't necessarily always see what's under the surface. We don't always see what's motivating their actions. Why are they making that decision? Why did they behave that way? And just because they may be doing the right things, just because they might align themselves with the letter of the law, there may be all kinds of ulterior motives and sinful thoughts and the wrong dispositions that are pushing those visible actions. And God judges the heart, right? Not just the hand that does the action. Not just on the outward perfection of religious action where it seems like they're doing exactly what they should be. But God's looking into the internal thoughts, that prideful way that it might be happening, or the dishonesty that might be behind it. Right can be wrong when my actions aren't following the purity of heart that God would desire. Let's note some examples. Notice Matthew chapter 6. And notice what happens when the right actions take place, but the wrong motives are there, and the condemnation that comes. Matthew chapter 6, again the words of Jesus, verse 5. Jesus says, when you pray, how could prayer ever be wrong, right? How could it ever be wrong? Well, when you pray, you shall not be like the hypocrites. For they love to pray, standing in the synagogues. Is it wrong to stand when you pray? Well, he's not talking about the action here. The conflict he has with these folks, the hypocrisy that he's seeing in them, doesn't have anything to do with the outward visible actions. It's the motive that they're letting those actions be motivated by. You shall not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the corner of the streets. Here's the problem, that they may be seen of men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. They were doing these things, stand up in the synagogue to pray, go down to the street corner to pray. They're doing these things to be seen of men. And at the end of the day, he says, once they've been seen of men, they've got what they sought. Because they're not getting anything from God. That's the implication, right? I hope they appreciated the attention they got. I hope they appreciated the attention men gave them when they stood in the synagogue or they stood down on the street to pray, because they've already received everything they're going to receive. The prayer was of no effect. That's Jesus' teaching. Their hypocrisy, their motives behind it, the idea of being seen of men motivated the actions. The actions were perfectly fine. Prayer's perfectly fine. Doing it in the synagogue or on the street, perfectly fine. Letter of the law. But the motives ruined it. Because it wasn't about God. It wasn't about communicating with Him. It wasn't about being pleasing to Him. It was all about, look at me. I'm a really religious guy. Paul even dealt with some interesting guys over in Philippians chapter 1. In Philippians chapter 1, verse 15 beginning, Paul said, some indeed preach Christ, even from envy and strife, and some also from goodwill. The former preach Christ from selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my chains, but the latter out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached, and this I rejoice yet and will rejoice. Is it right to preach Jesus? Yes. Do we always gain the benefit of that work and effort, regardless of motivation? Paul says no. I'm okay with the fact when people are talking about Jesus. But some of them are doing it in such a way in order to kind of create greater problems for me. Others are doing it in a way of goodwill for the promoting of the gospel. My simple point, friends, is this. Even the preaching of the gospel can happen with insincerity. There are those who can preach and teach, and they'll say the right things. It'll appear on the visible top to be exactly what the letter of the law extends. Everything will look like and sound like what it's supposed to, but because of their heart, their motives, their intents, their purposes, their reasonings, makes their efforts and work insincere. Paul even said in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, you remember he said, though I give my body to be burned, though I'm willing to sacrifice my literal existence, if I do it without love, it is nothing. What appears to be right, what visibly looks right, without the proper motive is wrong in the eyes of God. And so let's ask then, when we're trying to figure out what's right and wrong, and beyond just the letter of the law, right? Before I act on what it looks like is right, am I going to ask all the questions necessary? Is this going to show love towards my brother? Is this going to edify him or destroy his faith? Is this going to lift him up or make him weaker than he was to begin with? Is this an expedient action that will actually edify, or is this going to cause someone to stumble and fall? Am I blurring the lines between tradition, secular law, God's commands? Am I trying to morph those together rather than giving precedent to what God has commanded and instructed? Am I entrusting my actions solely based on a traditional view of something? Am I entrusting my behavior simply on the fact that the law of the land would permit it? Or am I willing to ask, does this pass through that gate of divine command of God? And then finally ask myself, what's my motive? What's my intent? What's the reason behind this? Why am I doing this? And I think sometimes that one is the most challenging of all. We can become so centered on doing what is right, we forget to ask ourselves, why am I doing this? Why did I choose to honor God? Why did I choose to follow Jesus? Why did I choose? And maybe I might even discover that my motives aren't where they ought to be. My motives might be out of envy or jealousies of others. My motives might be to try to manipulate the grace of God into my favor. My motives may be completely off base. And ultimately, if our process of discerning beyond the letter of the law of what's right and wrong doesn't pass through all the gates, if you will, then maybe I need to pause and think about my choices and decisions and how I'm discerning, Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 14, the difference between good and evil. We need to obey the commands of God. We talked about that a little bit this morning in some ways. I am in no way suggesting tonight that we don't have an obligation to fulfill the commands and instructions of God. My point tonight is simply illustrate what's your motive behind doing that. God wants more than just doing the action. He wants to know what my heart is thinking in that moment. He wants to know why I'm choosing that. The letter of the law isn't sufficient to get all the pieces of the puzzle right. So I ask you tonight, where's your heart leading you? What's your motive? What's your purpose? What are you thinking as it relates to God? How can we help you to step into His promises, to know salvation through Jesus, to find remission of sins through baptism if necessary, to restore your relationship with Him, to decide, I don't want to just do what is right, I want to believe in what's right. I want to be moved by what is right. I want to follow in God's instructions and let right be what God intended for it to be, and not miss any element. If we could help you, strengthen you, encourage you tonight, then we invite you to soberly think about your relationship with the Father. Won't you come as we stand and as we sing?